The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Humanity First. My name is Peter Evers, and we have a special guest coming up in a few minutes. We're going to be talking to Chris Ryan, and Chris is the host of the New Hampshire Today radio show, which is news radio, and we're going to talk a little bit of politics. We haven't done that for a while, but what's going on in the jockeying for positions for the president and other races that are going to be happening over the next 18 months, 2 years. Before that, I thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about substance use disorder. And it's strange the way that this topic came up this week, because you may well be aware that a tiny bag of cocaine was found in the White House, and there's been a great kerfuffle, or whatever, I can't spell that word, but kerfuffle around the issue of somebody finding this tiny piece of cocaine, and nobody knows where it came from. I guess it was in a heavy trafficked area where people visit on the weekends, and as usual, the sort of news carousel sort of talks about this on and on, when the real issue around substances remains an issue of public health for us. There's been recently a lot of research done, and let's begin with the fact that the issue around substance use disorder, which manifests itself in increasing number of overdose deaths in Massachusetts. Let's just take that. Since 2020, in the year 2020, we had about 230 deaths from overdoses. This year, we're going to break a record that we're not particularly proud of, I'm sure, in around about 2,350 deaths that we're on target for. This is really, really concerning for everybody, and everybody knows somebody, and everybody has a story about somebody who has struggled with addiction. We have an increase in deaths because of the amount of fentanyl that is found in all sorts of different drugs, from cocaine to methamphetamines to heroin, and now we have the additional worry of xylazine, which is actually a veterinary drug which is used for large animals, which is now being used and sold on the street coming in from China. It is a real problem because it's retailing at very, very cheap. We're talking like $6 for a pound or something like that, when you think about how that stacks up to the cost of drugs that are on the illegal market at the moment. And xylazine is so much stronger than fentanyl, and fentanyl is responsible for 93% of the deaths that are occurring in this state that occurred last year, when there were 2,300 deaths. We're not addressing the issue of public health here, and when we look at different ways of addressing addiction, we need to look farther afield. One of those places is Portugal. Portugal is a country that really took this on as an issue some 20 years ago, and they said we're going to decriminalize the possession of all drugs, and that's exactly what they did. And that sounds to us as Americans as something really, really scary. But the fact that we're not decriminalizing drugs means that we're still having an outrageous amount of people dying from this disease of addiction. What does it look like in Portugal now? Well, what it actually looks like is that the number of deaths have fallen precipitously. Interestingly enough, it's still illegal to use drugs in Portugal, and it is also distributing and dealing drugs is dealt with very harshly within the criminal justice system. But what we're talking about is changing an attitude towards the ability to recover. The other thing that they have over there and in other places are these consumption centers, places where people use drugs in a way that is safe, where people have the opportunity to talk about possible recovery. And those things in Portugal have just dropped the overdose death level enormously. There is still homelessness, there is still poverty, but addiction isn't fueling that homelessness and poverty. I'm not making a statement about what we should do around the issue of addiction and overdose death. But what I am saying is we really need to try something different, and we really need to think about a public health policy for this terrible disease. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMSI, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMSI because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse, and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamsijobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Welcome back, everybody. And as promised, we have Chris Ryan in the studio today. Chris, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, is an iHeart radio person who really covers political and sports news up in New Hampshire for New Hampshire Today. And Chris and I go back probably a decade now, where we've been.
It's been a long time.
Well, we've been talking on the air about issues of mental health, issues of behavioral health, and generally issues of social justice and what goes on in our community. So, a pleasure to have you here, Chris. Welcome.
Great to be here, Peter. Thank you for having me.
Some of the things that we've done over the years up in New Hampshire have been talking about presidential races and sort of fitting them into what changes might happen relative to mental health and substance use disorder. I have a very distinct memory of interviewing Bernie Sanders with you a few years ago, and you asked him a very direct question about about how he was going to pay for healthcare. I think it was one of the more amusing moments.
Bernie was big on platitudes, not so big on specifics. There's one, we could tell stories here all day, but there was one time where Bernie said that you used to be that a doctor would come to your home, he said. I'm like, so you're saying that under your plan, there would be doctors? No, I'm not saying that. I'm like, well, then why are we bringing up the doctor coming to your home then, Bernie?
It was a great moment. But obviously you have your finger on the pulse of what's going on at the moment, and you have guests on your show every day who are potential candidates, or actually are candidates for running. Basically, what's going on? I mean, I don't know if we're in a summer lull, but there are all of these subplots going on at the moment, aren't there? There's a president who is currently in that position, who is aging, who a lot of people are questioning about whether he could actually do another term. We also have a lead candidate on the other side who's been indicted a couple of times over the last few months. I don't know if we've ever had a political situation like this.
Yeah, the politics of it are fascinating in that you have two individuals who are remarkably unpopular amongst the American people. Joe Biden is about at 39%. Donald Trump is at 38% approval. But they are both the overwhelming favorites to win the nomination of their parties. Donald Trump is basically as far ahead of Ron DeSantis as Joe Biden is ahead of RFK Jr. And whenever Trump gets indicted or faces any, challenging circumstances, he does better within the Republican primary as they rally around him, and all the oxygen is taken out of the room for the other candidates who are vying to try to be competitive with him. So you have a remarkable dynamic, two incredibly unpopular presidents who are on the verge of being the nominees of their parties. And then America, a number of polls have showed 75% of Americans don't want to see Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. That's exactly what they're going to get.
That is odd, isn't it? Because does that mean, well, what does it mean? Does it mean that both parties are completely out of touch with the American public? Does it mean that both parties are sort of pandering to a small minority of people who happen to belong to their parties and are activists? Have we drifted way to the right and way to the left here? I'm not saying that Biden is way to the left, but he certainly adopted a lot of those policies. When is the middle going to be wrestled back, I suppose?
when there is a moment in time where they are kind of forced to be engaged. Because right now they're mostly apathetic. They don't want to hear about politics. If people are watching this, they're like, "Oh, I don't want to hear about Joe Biden and Donald Trump." But what those two do for each of the opposition parties is they create anger. Now, Joe Biden in his running against Trump the last time did not inspire a lot of anger, but with him winning and the questions amongst the right about that and the unproven allegations and claims, the hatred has developed for Joe Biden. So he's good for business on that side. Trump is good for business on the left because they're just looking to stir up their base to generate funds and interest and all of that. And big names can do that. And the middle, meanwhile, they don't want to think about politics. They don't want to hear about politics. Is Joe Biden this far out leftist socialist? He is not. Donald Trump is not really a conservative either in any way, shape, or form. So they've been branded as things that they're both not. I mean, Trump is an opportunist. Joe Biden is a centrist basically, and both of them are elderly.
Yeah, right.
Joe Biden is 80 years old. Donald Trump is 77, and this time period is one in which everyone is frustrated, but they're also kind of confused and fearful because the world is a very unstable place. I mean, you've mentioned some of the issues here, domestically with drug use, which is symptomatic of folks being, hopeless, fearful, economically deprived, dealing with mental illness that's untreated. So there's all those issues. Plus, we're coming out of the pandemic, which disrupted everybody's lives for years. There's concerns about what's happening internationally. The economy is unstable. It seems that inflation has come down, but there's still concerns about a recession. So it's a very strange dynamic in which people in the middle don't feel compelled to be engaged because they're so fed up. But the time to be engaged is now with the primary right there. If you don't like Donald Trump as a Republican candidate, in New Hampshire, or you vote with your feet here in Massachusetts and go up and volunteer for campaigns and engage in events and so forth, but not vote, obviously. Now is the time to change things.
Yeah, and there's so many other things going on in this sort of lattice work tapestry of what is going on politically. Supreme Court's a good example of that, right?
Yes.
This weird situation where within a one-term presidency there are 3 people put on the bench, which, Senator leftists would say some of the most radical politicized appointments ever, which is, of course, not true, as we know. But they are beginning to make a significant difference in some of the decisions they make, until you get these odd decisions from an opinion written by Neil Gorsuch, I think. No, it was one of the new ones. Kavanaugh, yeah, around the rights of Native Americans and land. You get the decision reversal on the right of people for universities to make decisions around race, and then loan forgiveness. It seems all over the map at the moment, and not necessarily what I think those people who have fought for a radical right Supreme Court have fought for.
Now, that's a really good point, but what is definitively clear is that the Supreme Court has become, if not the most powerful of the 3 branches of government, it's knocking on the door. And it seems that they have kind of definitely usurped the legislature and Congress in that they are, and I don't think it's because of necessarily their political bent or anything of that nature. I think it's just basically because Congress has given up on doing anything.
Nothing to get done.
Right. So therefore, they are kind of the Supreme Court is having to step up and settle a lot of those battles between the two, or, define things in regard to the law versus making judgments about what Congress has passed. And meanwhile, the executive branch has gotten more powerful in terms of its, from a, not necessarily from an actual standpoint, but from a focal point, while also using executive orders to govern more consistently than going through Congress, again, because Congress is broken. Mm-hmm. So the biggest problem to me is the fact that Congress is broken. And if anything is going to get done, it has to get done via executive order, which obviously, the next president can do away with that, or supposed to be the least powerful of the three co-equal branches of government. The judiciary is now stepping up and has become much more powerful than Congress.
And we know that there's been examples of that in the past, and we're looking at a period that probably goes back a number of years. I think about Citizens United, which was the beginning of this process. But I go further back than that because, the Democrats back in the 1980s sort of fought a nomination of Justice Bork. And it's almost as if the Republicans have been sort of remembering that and orchestrating and moving towards that. And yet Democrats have sat around and not done things that they could have done. And, take, of course, the most divisive issue in this country, which is the abortion rights. Mm-hmm. The Democrats could have settled that 15 years ago, but they didn't. And it's another example of really stagnation within the political process. I
think immigration as well. I mean, you could go through a number of different areas where Congress has not gotten anything done, and therefore, the Supreme Court had to step up on Dreamers. The Supreme Court had to step up on abortion because these issues are so divisive that the political figures, again, don't want to take on anything challenging because they may lose the next election. But you let it go to the judiciary and let the burden fall on them as to what the decision is, and then blame them for said decision. And basically, Congress has become about absolving themselves from any responsibility as opposed to taking on the responsibility of legislating.
Do you think that gerrymandering has done anything to do with that, Chris? Because I think about some of the Marjorie Taylor Greene is a good example of somebody, and I'm not getting into the politics of it, but somebody that can basically say anything they want. They can make stuff up, and I'm sure that people on the other side.
I mean, you could bring up Maxine Waters out in San Francisco, and there's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different examples. Gerrymandering is really bad for the country, and we've also seen. I talked with Governor Burgum from North Dakota, who's running, and also Governor Chris Sununu, about how more people are, because of the legislative action taken at the state level, are moving from state to state based upon where they feel the most free, where they feel that their way of life, their belief system is going to be honored. So there's the gerrymandering that takes place. And there's also, control of the legislature and people moving to states, like a lot of people from Massachusetts moving up to New Hampshire because they feel that Massachusetts doesn't represent them from a certain viewpoint. Moving maybe from New Hampshire to Massachusetts because of how they feel about issues. And people are making those decisions. It's not the leading factor of why people move, but it's much more than it used to be.
And I think it's true across the world as well. I mean, if you look at Europe, you're getting a much more divisive group of people there. And it makes you wonder, are we moving into a period of non-compromise because the issues are so divisive and radicalized?
I think we're beyond that at this point. I think we are in an area of there is no benefit to compromise because, again, the middle is so disengaged. And if you give anything and work with the other side, because there's been such a team sport type hatred thing that's been built up, there's nothing to be gained if you are a Republican working with a Democrat in most circumstances. Same thing, from the other side of the aisle. So there are examples of compromising existing at the state level, and the local level happens every day. I mean, very often the best government is local government. But from a federal level, I mean, anytime Joe Biden works with Republicans, that's something that his base gets upset about. And same thing with Trump. One of the interesting things in Trump's interview with Bret Baier on Fox News was that he mentioned a Democratic friend who talked about how great the vaccine was and how much he should be talking about that. And he's like, well, I can't really talk about that because a lot of people on my side don't really think the vaccine was a good thing. And that really indicates, you could make an argument that Trump's biggest accomplishment in office was Operation Warp Speed, and you could talk about the vaccine or whatever for a long period of time, but just the process of creating a vaccine that instilled enough confidence in the American people to return to their way of life. I mean, that's a pretty significant accomplishment and something that his administration did. But like he was saying in the interview, he doesn't talk about it because his base is so upset when it's mentioned.
Which sort of takes us back to the reason for politics, or the reason people go into politics. Because oftentimes, if you think about some of the greatest politicians, in the world, they've really taken on issues or had issues forced upon them that they don't necessarily have consensus over,
Right.
but will drive a point. You think about issues that in the old days were taken on and says, look, I know people don't agree with this. The death penalty or getting rid of the death penalty, which is really pretty much a moot point in this country nowadays, except for a few places. The majority of Americans do not agree with doing away with the death penalty, but there is a moral feeling in this country around that's not right. And people have driven that over the years, or I think a really good example of saying, I am going to fight what I believe is right. I don't get that feeling with a Donald Trump, for instance, who says, I can't say that because the majority of people who get me in, and therefore my goal is here to be in some sort of power, will disagree with me. It's a different way of looking at why you're a politician.
Yeah, Donald Trump is a different type of politician, where he is there because he wants to be in on the action, and he will utilize the mechanisms in order to have success versus having an overriding reason to have success. Like there is no goals, like from a policy perspective, that Donald Trump has. The goals that he has are based upon relationships that he can build in order to get to where he wants, which was to the White House initially, or back to the White House again. Like he doesn't have a strong feeling on pro-life issue, doesn't have a strong feeling about a lot of policy issues. So that's one of the things that you'll be interested to see as this primary moves forward. Is the other candidates are much more true and tried it when it comes to their belief systems and the policy initiatives that they want to engage on. And in fact, somebody like Ron DeSantis, Mike Pence, and Tim Scott on the life issue are running far to the right of Donald Trump, and he has actually shifted back towards the center and said, you're going too far on the abortion issue, you're going too far on these other issues. And that's been pretty interesting in that he has been able to tack back towards the center from a political standpoint, but it's all under the conceptualization of the indictments and everything else, and what is that going to mean for his candidacy down the road. And currently it means that he is going to have success because the Republican Party and people voting in primaries back him overwhelmingly in these situations. But when it comes to the general election, it's a completely different beast.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we didn't want transactional politics, I suppose the country wouldn't have voted once for Donald Trump. And it's interesting that they went back to much more tried and tested measures. But Chris, it's been a pleasure. It's going to be interesting to see how things fold out over the next few months. And hopefully you'll come back and talk a little bit more when we're further down the line.
Sounds great. We'll check back in.
Thanks a lot, everybody.